as Amanda said, you can imagine, taxi drivers come to pick me up. They've been told they're picking up Kate Mosse. I come to the door. You'll be surprised to know that when they see me, I am not mistaken for a supermodel. And they always do this wonderful thing. They say, "You're much prettier than her." And I go, "No, it's fine." And they go, but this evening, and picking up on Jeff's wonderful speech, I feel obliged to not only apologise for not being a supermodel, but also to apologise for not being Stephen Fry. Because I am here in place of Stephen Fry. And Stephen, of course, is a national treasure. And you've had him being brilliant and wonderful in 12th Night over here for some time. But he is doing what writers should be doing, which is he has gone back to his desk and he is not allowed out. But I am only allowed out because it is publication day today. So thank you. And it's just fantastic to be here and listen to the amazing speakers that we've had already. And Michael, who's about to come on, we feel a bit overwhelmed and intimidated now. But he's got a piano, and I have absolutely nothing except the fact that I am not a supermodel. Anyway, in 1989, my husband and I, bought a tiny house in the shadow of the medieval city walls of a place called Carcassonne in the southwest of France. I'd never heard of the place, didn't know anything about it. And it was one of those moments where we were only there through coincidence and luck. My wonderful mother-in-law, who lives with us in England, as does my fantastic mum, had retired. She was a teacher, and she had been given a small lump sum of money. And she decided to buy with us this tiny house. And the only reason we were there in this place called Carcassonne was that she had a friend who had a friend who had a friend who was a real estate agent in the place that we live in England. And she was twinned with an estate agent in this place called Carcassonne. Now, I often look back and think what would have happened if we'd been twinned with, in England, you see, at this point I would make the joke, Bognor Regis. But I see, even in New York, you know about Bognor Regis. But it's one of those extraordinary things. So we went there for the first time in 1989, and we got off the train and walked down through the modern town, which is 14th century, and walked to the... Sorry, I am English. As I said to Stephen, I will keep making the English joke all night. So when it's not funny and they wish it was you, I will just say, I am English, and it will work. And we got all the way through the modern town. And those of you who've been to Europe will know that there's a thing that happens out of season in the winter. At 7:01, when the shops shut, everybody disappears. There is nobody to be seen at all. And all we would hear every now and again was this. There'd be these footsteps somewhere elsewhere. And we got to the old bridge, the Pont Vieux that goes over the River Aude, and ahead on the hill, I saw a medieval city, a full medieval city with 52 towers and 2 rings of walls, and it was a coup de foudre. I just fell in love. And more than that, I felt that I belonged there, that somehow it was my place. And over the next few years, because you do when you fall in love, I wanted to learn everything about that part of France and the history of that part of France. And I learned about a group of Christian heretics called the Cathars who had lived and died in that part of France in the 13th century. And that was the novel that became Labyrinth. And when I was writing that, I was talking to my beloved dad, who passed away a couple of years ago. And I was saying, Daddy, do you remember when I was little and you used to read stories to me at bedtime? And I was lucky because I was the eldest. I got my dad reading stories to me when my poor mum was doing the babies in the bath stuff in another room. And so my dad, being a man of a certain age, he was 88 when he died, he read me the stories that he had read as a child. And they are all, of course, utterly inappropriate. So he read me, for example, when I was 5, King Solomon's Mines, which is all blood and violence and impaling and sex, different sort of impaling, and it was all very, very inappropriate. But of course, I didn't know this, and my father just thought it was jolly good fun, and then he would read me Voyage to the Centre of the Earth. And out of this, I had this great love of detective adventure fiction. And adventure fiction is different from thrillers, because adventure fiction exists in this, if you like, a very old-fashioned moral landscape. There are goodies and there are baddies. There is a sense of a world that is perfect, that is perhaps lost, and that it will be challenged in some sort of way, but the resolution of the story will be that right comes through, that the order of the world is re-established. So when I was writing Labyrinth, I said to my dad, I'm writing an old-fashioned adventure story, Daddy, just like the sort you used to read me. And I said, but it's got a twist. The heroes in my story are women. And rather than waiting around on the hillside to be rescued, they're the ones that are on horseback. They're the ones with the hordes doing the rescuing. And my father looked at me over the top of his glasses and he said, darling, I've waited all of my life for a woman on a horse to come and rescue me. And I thought, well, if my lovely dad likes the sound of this, I could be on to something. Now, all of the novels that I've written inspired by France are love letters, really, to that part of France that became my home and welcomed us in. But the last one, Citadel, which is published today, is particularly special because this year is the 70th anniversary of the events that inspired Citadel. So although it is an adventure story, although it is also a love letter to Carcassonne, it is also inspired by the fact that for nearly 25 years, when I walk around the modern town, the Bastide, I look up on the street signs and I have seen that all the roads in the center of the Bastide have been renamed for resistance fighters who gave their lives in the Second World War. Now, that is not unusual in Europe. Everywhere, rightly, people are remembered in street signs, in roads, in memorials, particularly monuments in the First World War and a few in the Second. But after a while, I started to notice something very odd, which was that the date of death on every single one of those street signs was the same, the 19th of August, 1944. Now, being a novelist, and by nature, novelists are nosy, I wanted to know what had happened on that day. And this is what I found out. That the Carcassonne resistance, who had been fighting the Nazi occupation for several years, had all one by one been captured during the course of July and the early part of August in 1944. And they were taken to the jail in Carcassonne, and there they were held until dawn on the 19th of August. And then, for reasons we still don't know, the Wehrmacht and the SS came and they took all of the resistance away and they took them to a place outside of Carcassonne, a place called Baudrigue, a beautiful, beautiful stately home. And there they were all murdered in the most barbaric and extraordinary way. They all had hand grenades put in their mouths and they were blown up so that they could never be identified. And this act of spite haunted me for 25 years. Not just that it is awful to lose your husband or your son or your wife or your daughter or your friend, but to not know what had happened to them. And what was even more haunting, if you like, was that over, as I started to research, I discovered that they withdrew the Nazi occupation and the French collaborationist militia that night. So for the want of a few hours, those sons and daughters and husbands and wives and friends would have been in the pictures that we have of Carcassonne on the 20th of August, walking down from the hills, having liberated their own town. Now, over the past 70 years, because this is the 70th anniversary of those murders, they have identified almost everybody. And there is now, in the beautiful parkland of Baudrigue, 3 tombstones that reflect the names that are on the wall in Carcassonne. The first one is to a man called Jean Branger, codenamed Muriel, who was the leader of the Carcassonne resistance. The second is to Aimé Raymond, for my money, the most romantic of the men, I suppose. He carved his last will and testament in the local language Occitan with a pin on the wall of his cell, and he was a serving police officer. The final one is to all the other men who died that day, and they are all listed name by name. At the bottom of that third tombstone is the line that inspired Citadel, which is back to the idea of women heroes that I told my dad about. And it simply says, and 2 unknown women. No one has ever found out who those women were. I would like to think that their parents and children knew what they had done. But we will never know that. But I'm a novelist, not a historian. So I can't write the truth of what happened, what people did, what compromises they made, what they were prepared to sell of themselves or their principles in order to help other people to survive. The wonderful people that we know who last time I was in the restaurant and I had a group of German film people with me were behaving very oddly. And after they'd gone, I'd said, you know, what was going on there? You're normally so welcoming and polite. And the old woman who was in the resistance herself took me to the center of the restaurant and she lifted up a rug and she said, the last time that I heard this much German spoken in my parents' restaurant, I had 20 Jewish children in that cellar. So we don't know what compromises, what people had to sell of themselves, if you like, to help all of us to be free. It sounds very grand, but it is still true. But I knew one thing. I didn't know who those women were, but I knew the sort of women they must have been. And they would have been women like us, we hope. Most of us have never been tried in quite that way, but we would hope that we would be those people who would be prepared to stand up and do the right thing. And so I thought I could write a novel that honored the spirit of those amazing women and honored the spirit of the amazing men who must have loved them and cared for them to made it to have been possible for them to be part of the resistance. So when I was thinking about tonight and not being Stephen Fry and not being a supermodel and all of those things, I came back, well, I obviously think about that quite a lot. I came back to the fact about the theme of tonight, you know, are you for sale? And the truth is, mostly we don't have to decide. But you know what? We're really lucky. And one of the things that you do when you're writing a book is to answer the questions that you hope you might never have to answer in real life. And at the very end of his life, my wonderful dad, who was a soldier in the Second World War, who was an 18-year-old boy, stepped off the boat on D-Day +18. And as he got off the boat, his first commission, his commanding officer was shot next to him and went down. And for a matter of hours, my father was in charge. And he only talked to me about this in the last few weeks of his life. And he said one thing. He said, it is very, very important to listen and to think and to understand and make the judgments that you would make. But remember that it is very hard to know what any of us are capable of or not capable of until we are called to account. And he said, living under occupation, the poison of that is entirely different from the freedom of being a soldier, a freedom of knowing that you stand in the right place. And I kept that in my mind because I was writing Citadel as my dad was dying, and then he died. And then I went back to the book and I sort of shook it out because there was too much grief on those pages that didn't belong. But what I was left was with this, that the reason that any of you come to listen to all of us and that we listen to each other is because the one thing that we can do as writers, as composers, as journalists, as choreographers, whatever it is we do, is that we can write and we can share words and we can share stories. Because everybody in this room has a different taste. We have a different idea. Some of you will love France, some of you will never have been there and not want to go at all. But the stories of those brave women and those brave men are no different from the stories that we are seeing all over the world today. And all we can do as writers is find a sort of truth, an emotional truth about what matters about books, what matters about words. Because the one thing that I am sure of, and I say this with who knows where my beloved dad is, but the one thing I know is that the words that he read to me and I heard, and the words that I write and hopefully other people will read, is the thing that connects us all, whether women or men, black or white, whatever faith we are or none, whatever country we live in. And that's why to be able to be here and stand on a stage and share it with such amazing other writers, to people who want to hear stories on a publication day when I'm not Stephen Fry and I'm not a supermodel, has been a great honor. Thank you very much.